Schönen guten Tag, liebe Seherinnen und Hörer des YouTube-Kanals der Zeitschrift International. Hier spricht wieder Fritz Edlinger. Das ist heute wiederum nur ein ganz kurzer Vorspann zu einem in englischer Sprache gehaltenen Gespräch zwischen unserem regelmäßigen Mitarbeiter, in Japan tätigen Schweizer Politikwissenschaftler Pascal Lothas und einen der führenden US-amerikanischen Politikwissenschaftler und Journalisten, Dr. Anatol Lieven. Dr. Anatol Lieven ist Direktor eines Instituts, eines liberalen Instituts in den USA namens Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Und die sind vor allem in Amerika, aber inzwischen auch weltweit in der aktuellen Diskussion um Sicherheitspolitik natürlich in erster Linie anhand des Ukraine-Krieges und der Ukraine-Aggression Russlands eine wichtige Stimme, die zu Mäßigung aufrichtet, die sich gegen Kriegshetze ausspricht. Und es ist also ein Gespräch, das vor wenigen Tagen in englischer Sprache, wie gesagt, aufgenommen worden ist. Für jene, die sich das lieber mit deutschen Untertiteln anhören und ansehen möchten, erinnere ich an die Funktion, die ja inzwischen auf jedem Computer bei YouTube installiert ist. Dann können Sie sich das eben mit deutschen Untertiteln auch anhören und ansehen. Es ist ein Gespräch, wo unterschiedliche Positionen gegeneinander abgewogen werden. Der äußere Anlass dieses Gespräches, das möchte ich auch noch erwähnen für Interessenten, die dann Dingen auf die Spur, auf die eben nachgehen wollen. Es hat vor relativ kurzer Zeit einen Artikel gegeben des früheren französischen Präsidenten Sarkozy, der im Wesentlichen entsprechend einer traditionellen französischen Haltung, die ja doch innerhalb der westlichen Staatengemeinschaft und auch innerhalb Europas eher eine mäßigende ist und eine, die gegen allzu aggressive kriegerische Handlungen sich ja immer wiederum seit de Gaulle ausgesprochen hat. Und Sarkozy hat einen Artikel publiziert, wo er eben auch bestimmte Positionen, die jetzt gang und gäbe sind, die jetzt die Mehrheitspositionen sind, doch in Frage gestellt hat. Und Anatol Lieven hat darüber eben auch einen zusätzlichen Artikel geschrieben und das Gespräch zwischen den beiden handelt eben um wesentliche Voraussetzungen und aktuelle Fragen, die sich jeden von uns in Wirklichkeit, der an internationaler Politik interessiert ist und der Angst hat, dass das noch weiter, wenn es überhaupt noch möglich ist, noch weiter außer Kontrolle geraten kann, der soll sich das ansehen. Und ich glaube, dass jeder von euch dann Assoziationen hat und sicher einsteigen wird in weitere Überlegungen. In diesem Sinn herzlichen Dank auch an Pascal Lothas, der uns dieses Video zur Verfügung gestellt hat. Es ist im Original erschienen auf dem YouTube-Kanal von Pascal Lothas, Neutrality Studies. In diesem Sinn kann man auf gut Wienerisch nur sagen, schauen Sie sich das an. Es mag für manche überraschend sein, es mag für manche auch provokant sein, aber wir sind in Zeiten, wo man sich eigentlich derartige Provokationen einfach ansehen sollte und vielleicht doch in der einen oder anderen Frage dann etwas nachdenklicher wird, wenn man die überwiegende Meinung der Mainstream-Medien und auch der europäischen und westlichen Politik sich ansieht. In diesem Sinn herzlichen Dank und bis zum nächsten Mal.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Anatol Lieven, who's the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He was formerly a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar and in the War Studies Department of King's College in London. Last week, Anatol wrote a wonderful piece in Responsible Statecraft entitled Sarkozy Vilified for Speaking Uncomfortable Truths About Ukraine, in which he argues that our beloved mass media is ignoring what Sarkozy says and instead just condemns him and cites and quotes all the people who condemn him for what he said, although that is absolutely within the realm of reason. Anatol, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Pascal. Thank you for inviting me.
So Anatol, your piece is wonderful and everybody should go and read it. It's short and you're saying like, look, what Sarkozy is saying is nothing special. Can you lay out for us, I mean, what he said and why you think it's reasonable?
Well, the crazy thing is that most of what Sarkozy said has actually been said by other American and European officials, either in private briefings, but which have been published in newspapers, including New York Times and Washington Post and so forth, or actually on the record, which is that ultimately there will have to be negotiations. Biden himself has said this again and again. But of course, if you'll get, also now in recent weeks, we have had more and more military experts, and by the way, even before the Ukrainian offensive, you had the Pentagon and the CIA warning that it was unlikely to succeed, or at least not fully succeed. And now, of course, you have more and more official and unofficial military experts saying that, no, I mean, it's bogged down. It has made limited gains, but this is not going to lead to a smashing victory this year. And so Sarkozy basically said, look, there are going to be negotiations. We have to start talking about what the terms of those negotiations will be. And that, on the assumption that that we're not going to be able to destroy Russia as a state, Russia is going to remain a neighbor with which we are going to have to deal. And finally, I mean, I think the thing that really, of course, infuriated the American establishment and the transatlantic, European establishment, which to all intents and purposes is American by now. Anything that gets money from NATO, any think tank, any individual, is working for the American establishment, let's face it. They, of course, were absolutely infuriated when he suggested that, look, on this issue, the interests of Europe and the interests of America are not identical. Well, hello. Actually, yes. I mean, European countries do have their own interests once upon a time. I mean, the surprising thing, the most surprising thing for me, but it's not new, I've been sort of surprised by this so often in recent years, is that every word that Sarkozy said would have been said by de Gaulle. And every French politician, except possibly the extreme left, tries to wrap themselves in the mantle of de Gaulle and say, or imply or suggest, I am the new de Gaulle. But of course, they have adopted a policy towards following America's lead that Charles de Gaulle would have despised and automatically rejected. But I think the main thing is there is this deep hypocrisy, but it's a very dangerous hypocrisy because it does actually block any possibility of significant talks, in which the West says, we must bring Putin to the negotiating table. Putin has not shown that he is ready for talks. We must put pressure on Russia to come and negotiate a peace settlement. And then the obvious next question is, well, okay, so what are the terms you're offering for such talks? So, what would bring Putin to negotiate? And the answer is, unconditional surrender. Russia must leave everywhere, not just everything it's occupied since last year, but Crimea and the eastern Donbass as well. And by the way, we're also going to pursue, charges of war crimes against Russia. And by the way, we make no guarantees whatsoever that even if Russia does this, that the sanctions will be lifted. Well, I mean, what Sarkozy has basically done is drawn the logical conclusion of saying, if indeed you are trying to bring Putin to the negotiating table, what are the terms? Not just that Putin, because I've had many conversations with people in Russia, including, shall we say, at least people who used to be in the top elites, though they would acknowledge themselves that they're not anymore, about what terms the wider Russian elites and indeed the wider population would accept. And those terms do not include unconditional surrender, and under no circumstances include the surrender of Crimea and the eastern Donbass. And what Sarkozy also proposed was something that a number of wise Western commentators have proposed, including former senior US diplomat Tom Graham, which is, look, the only legitimate way out of this, which also retains a measure of moral legitimacy and international legal legitimacy, is in the end to do something which would seem to me absolutely obvious, but which Western governments have rigorously ignored, which is to say, ask the local people. Have local referenda, on where these places want to go.
Internationally supervised, right?
Of course, as Sarkozy said. And of course, this is going to be difficult because there are so many refugees. It couldn't happen for a number of years. There would have to be all sorts of mechanisms put in place, but those can be negotiated. But I think as a basic principle to get us out of this war, and perhaps also, to save Ukraine from suffering much greater losses in future, including territorial losses, this should be an obvious line of approach. Now, I fully understand why the Ukrainian government and a great many Ukrainians, I don't think it is possible to say with any confidence exactly the balance of opinion within Ukraine in present circumstances. But I understand why the Ukrainian government rejects this. I understand why a great many people in the West have deep reservations about it. But okay, then, discuss this. Let us have a public discussion about this in which everyone can bring forward ideas. Do not take one of basically the only two really significant national figures who has actually proposed a concrete way out and refuse, even to talk about his ideas on the supposed grounds that he is a traitor and a Putin agent and all this kind of thing. This is not a democratic debate. And it's certainly not a debate which is in any way useful for anybody involved, including Ukraine.
No, it's not a useful debate. What this is just the logic of war, right? That makes sure that people, that their minds are captured in a very narrow net and makes sure that they're directed towards more death and destruction to the enemy, even at the price of your own death and destruction, and certainly at the price of the Ukrainian death and destruction, right? This is what war does to people. This is why I think Europe is mentally, at least, at war. That's for utterly sure. Now, the thing is, the reason why the Western elite wouldn't say okay to local referendums is probably because we know that the whole part in the East is way, way, way more drawn towards Russia. And a viewer of this channel sent me a very interesting map of the 2014 election, the electoral map of not 2014, sorry, 2010, when Yanukovych was elected, and you can see the split in Ukraine, which is highly geographical. Now, we don't know if this would turn out again this way, but it would be obvious that probably at least Crimea and large parts of the Donbass would vote for being with Russia, and that is something that Western leaders say. So therefore, these populations don't get a vote, or how do you see that?
Well, I think that's right. But on the other hand, I was in Ukraine in March, and I stayed for 10 days in Zaporizhia. I hadn't intended to stay that long. I ended up in hospital as a result of an accident. But as a result, I got the chance of having long conversations, of course, all off the record, because mostly people would not talk on the record, with nurses, doctors, fellow patients, and so forth. And Zaporizhia, the city on the Ukrainian side, the province in the south is held by Russia. Well, I mean, there was considerable discontent with the government in Kiev, and certainly with some of its ethno-nationalist policies, language policies, and so forth. But I did find that attitudes to Russia and the Russian state, the Russian government and the Russian army, had shifted very, very considerably from when I visited these areas before the war. Not necessarily to the Russian people, because of course there was only one person who I met in all those 10 days who was not actually, in terms of ethnicity, a mixture of Ukrainian and Russian in Zaporizhia. But the thing is, even though the bombardment of Zaporizhia by Russia has not been very intense, nonetheless, it's been quite continuous and quite a lot of people have been killed. And of course, after spending a year, as it was then, being bombarded by Russia, doesn't make you love the Russian state or the Russian Air Force. Well, my impression was that in these areas of eastern Ukraine, that if you had an honest referendum, probably, in my view, having been there, you would get a large majority vote to stay with Ukraine in these areas. But on the other hand, in the eastern Donbass, which has been quasi-independent since 2014, that has been even more intensively bombarded by Ukraine over a longer period, with, nobody's exactly sure, but somewhere between 12 and 20,000 civilians killed, over the years. Well, by the same token, I would be very doubtful if that has made people there love Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces and wish to return to Ukrainian rule. Crimea, of course, has also been more likely bombarded, but Crimea, was also subjected to a Ukrainian water blockade, which one can imagine if the Ukrainians reconquer the land bridge to Crimea, they will reinstitute the water blockade. So it cuts both ways. I mean, undoubtedly, the Russian has bitterly alienated many people in Ukraine who were previously sympathetic to Russia. But Ukrainian, behavior over the past 8 years has alienated a lot of people in the eastern Donbass who previously, I think, from my travels and researches, would have accepted, if the Ukrainians had offered it, autonomy within Ukraine. I am doubtful that they would accept that today.
Yeah. Probably. And so in a sense, it would be kind of open to the question of how many people from what ethnicity vote for what. So it would be really, really difficult to do this referendum in a proper way. And people who oppose it have a point in saying, like, hey, how can you organize elections under such circumstances? Although that is kind of a very shallow argument. But I have a more pressing question to you, Anatol. Like, you and I, we belong to the people who I would think see things in a sane way and want peace, in the sense that you wrote a wonderful article a year ago about Ukraine's coming neutrality when there was these talks in end of March, and then everything was destroyed by Boris Johnson and the West, who said, like, no, don't do it, go and fight. And now we have 400,000 or so dead Ukrainians and 200 or 300,000 dead Russians. It's an utter, complete catastrophe. But we know that there are people in the United States, in Brussels, in London, who are saying, like, oh, well, in the words of the great warmonger Madeleine Albright, it's worth it. So how is it that that still, like, so large parts of the European population and the American population are still caught in that it's worth it, or don't see that this is what the game is?
Well, in military circles and all these, security analysts linked to the military in Europe as well as in America, or I would say in the Americanized European security establishments, there is this, absolutely deeply rooted zero-sum thinking. And they've now classified Russia as an enemy. Many of them have done so, by the way, for many years. I mean, many of them never. I was in America in the 1990s in Washington, and I remember when I first came in as a visiting fellow in 1996 at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And after a few weeks, I wrote to my brother saying, this town is still full of people who have this pathological hatred of Russia. Despite the end of the Cold War, despite, the Soviet Union ceasing to exist, they hate Russia. They really want Russia as an enemy. And if this goes on indefinitely, there will be a war. And I said this 27 years ago. I was right. There has been a war. But there is now, and you see this, from all these generals writing, that there is this belief that it is simply a good thing to wear down Russia, to weaken the economy, to kill Russians, irrespective of how many Ukrainians die in the process, or the economic damage to Europe, or the damage, to wider Western interests in the world, including, of course, the issue of climate change. It's just this belief that anything that damages Russia must be good. Now, you see, I was sensitized to this at a pretty early age because, and I talk about this in one of my books. I covered from the side of the Mujahideen the resistance against the communists and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in the late 1980s. And by late 1988, it was clear that the Soviets were withdrawing. It was also entirely clear that the Mujahideen were bitterly hostile to each other, and that their takeover was going to be a catastrophe for Afghanistan. And a colleague, Kathy Gannon of Associated Press, and I cornered at a diplomatic party. I think he was the head, or was he the deputy head of the U.S. Information Service in Islamabad. We had a pretty good idea of what that meant. And we said, look, you've won. The Soviets are leaving. All this stuff about the Soviet Union marching to the Persian Gulf is over. Gorbachev is, seeking agreements with the West and reforming at home. Why still pouring guns and money to the Mujahideen, who we all know are a dreadful collection, with deeply retrograde cultural attitudes, basically the fathers of the Taliban, and also who threatened chaos to Afghanistan. And we pushed him back. And in the end, he said, look, Soviet withdrawal is not enough. We want total humiliation. We're going to do to them, what they did to us in Vietnam. This is not about Afghanistan. And we said, and it's not about the Afghan people either. And he said, basically, no, who gives a shit?
It's so absolutely dreadful that that line.
The terrible thing is that they don't learn, because they of course what happened in Afghanistan as a result was a catastrophe for everybody, including the United States.
Now, I believe that it took me a year to learn this or to understand this. You've written about this for a long time, and I believe that by now Russia is utterly, there's no more illusions, right? We know that there was an illusion in the 90s and the early 2000s that the West actually wants cooperation. And we now know that the people in the driving seat, or the people who were able to push the state, the state machinery, didn't want that. Is, as you said, it's like this mentality never went away. And the Russians by now, I believe they know that. Now, with this at the back of our minds, if you think about people like Dmitry Trenin and so on, what do you think that their recipe is in order to make sure that Russia is secure? Because we know now that we cannot trust the West. They will break any and every agreement. Even the grain deal was broken from the West to the point that the Russians say, we just not going to extend it anymore. Now, what would be the most reasonable Russian strategy to make sure that under these circumstances you can still have a more or less workable agreement?
Well, I think you see something that has not been sufficiently noticed is that for many, many years, almost a doctrine of Russian policy, and this, by the way, goes back to Yeltsin and even actually to Andrei Kozyrev in the 1990s, is that we need to appeal to the French and Germans to make what we think are reasonable agreements with us to, maintain European security, to avoid crises, and, not to exclude America completely. Nobody dreamed of that. No sensible person, but basically to do what Sarkozy has talked about, which is to recognize that there are European interests that are not the same as those of the United States, and to try to make agreements with Russia accordingly. Now, that of course was denounced, especially in Poland, and I understand the Poles and the Balts, and I sympathize with them, but that doesn't necessarily mean, of course, agreeing with somebody. This was all presented as a new Yalta, Germany and Russia carving up Europe between them. This was, by the way, at the heart of, a badly presented and in itself unviable proposal by Medvedev when he was president for a new European security order, which once again, instead of saying, look, there are problems with this, but we think it's an interesting idea, let's talk about it, European governments simply, and America, of course, just rejected that ad fab. There was no discussion at all. Well, nonetheless, this dream of appealing to the Germans and French was critical in my view, especially the Putin's desire to retain a relationship with Merkel, to the fact, which not nearly enough people talk about, the question, why did Russia not do in 2014 what it did last year? Why did Russia not invade Ukraine in 2014? In the name of a democratically elected president, against what in the end was a coup, even if it started in a popular uprising, and of course with a perfect casus belli, which America would certainly have used, which was atrocities against pro-Russian demonstrators in Odessa. Now, a key reason, in my view, the key reason they didn't, was that they did not want to wreck the relationship with Germany and France. And that was kept alive through the Minsk process. Then, oddly enough, it came back in a negative kind of way after 2016, because the election of Donald Trump suggested, a deepening cultural political gulf between Europe and America that Russia could play on. And Russian friends of mine started talking again about Russia as a third West. Look, we know we're from Europe, yes, but then America is very different from Europe. So, we can still all get on together. But I think the German and French refusal actually to live up to Minsk. And now, of course, for Russians, that has been absolutely confirmed by Merkel and Hollande, saying this was always a trick. We never intended it, honestly or seriously. Plus, of course, the absolute flight back to America after the election of Joe Biden. I think that just wrecked this Russian agenda, and that was critical in the end. Germany and France had ceased to be able to play any kind of role as successful mediators, with Russia. And of course, the stupid thing is that by continuing to pretend to play this role, Macron has lost all credit in Eastern Europe, where he's universally despised. But at the same time, of course, has lost all credit in Russia, where he's totally distrusted. So, one question is, can a role for Europe be reconstructed in dealing with Russia? Is there anything that Europe can actually offer to the Russians that would be halfway convincing?
The question is, who would be willing to do that? Because we have seen in Italy Meloni, who was elected, who used to be like more of a maybe we need to get along with the Russians, and then she was immediately brought into the boat, and she's now firmly in the in NATO speak. We in France, even if the Front National went somewhere, and what's her name,
Le Pen.
Le Pen became president in 3 or 4 years' time. There's no guarantee that this wouldn't just repeat again. It seems to me that the Europeans are so closely in this little mental corset. I wonder where the corset is coming from, because there must be some coercion from the outside. But the mental corset is so narrow that if I was Russian, I would be deeply worried that what to do with these people.
Well, I think part of it, to be brutally honest, is exactly what the Russians warned about when the whole question of Polish and East European membership of NATO came up. They said, look, you are importing into NATO. I remember I was at diplomatic dinners where this was said. You are taking into NATO people who hate Russia. And it's not just about communism, it's about conflicts going back hundreds of years. And they will use their influence within NATO and the European Union implacably to turn these organizations against Russia and to wreck any possibility of cooperation. And the response from Western diplomats was, no, you're being, of course, the usual word, paranoid. You're being paranoid. You're exaggerating. Once these countries are in NATO and the European Union, they will feel safe. They will no longer feel threatened by Russia. And then all this business of historical animosity will go away. Well, as if. But an EU official in Brussels last autumn, when I was there, also said something very interesting on that score. Said, look, in any room where you have 27 people, where 22, shall we say, or maybe depending on the issue, 21 or 23, what they are really interested in is maintaining unity and consensus and not having public splits, and above all not having anything that could lead to a really deep public split. And you have 4 or 5, depending on the issue once again, who do not give a damn about unity, who are simply determined to get their way at all costs, whatever happens, and are entirely willing to wreck any negotiation, any agreement, any cooperation in order to get their way, and in this case, towards Russia. Who's going to win? Who's going to win? Like in any human interaction, who's going to win?
Yeah. Now, a bit of a different question, but one of the things that I think is coming apart now is this narrative of Ukraine is winning. We are seeing now Ukraine is not winning. The opposite is probably the case, and there's only going to be two options: either escalate from the western side, NATO, and start sending in forces from the outside, because the Ukrainians are going to run out of people. They are now contemplating a draft, and bring in all of these people who have no business fighting whatsoever, or actually go for some sort of settlement that Sarkozy is actually talking about. And on the Russian side, you then have to decide whether or not you're going to push on and try to go further into Ukraine and go into the territory of the people who would rather do suicide bombing than be with you, or go for a settlement. Do you think that at some point we are reaching a stalemate logic that will make negotiations along the lines of Sarkozy more reasonable, more likely, or not?
At some stage, yes. I mean, I should say, by the way, that given that all the military analysts, including myself, were so often proved wrong and surprised last year, I'm very hesitant to make any definite predictions. The Ukrainians have surprised us a number of times. Of course, the Russians have also now surprised the more optimistic Western analysts as well. So, as in any war, we cannot say for sure what will happen. At the moment, things certainly seem to be more on the Russian side. Now, however, and by the way, I mean, this was true to a considerable degree in the First World War as well, and as far as Russia was concerned, of course, you have to pay attention to domestic politics. Now, it must, of course, always be acknowledged, and all my Russian friends who used to be insiders now confess this absolutely themselves. We're not insiders anymore. We actually don't know what Putin is thinking, or his immediate coterie, which is, narrowed to maybe half a dozen people. So we don't know. Nonetheless, clearly, as part of the suppression of Wagner, Putin has also acted to not savagely crack down on, but certainly to dampen and sideline some of the most extreme nationalist elements in the Russian elites, as far as Ukraine is concerned. These are the people who are still aiming at total military victory, the conquest of the whole of Ukraine, and to do that have been publicly advocating mobilization along the lines of 1942, conscript the entire male population, nationalize all businesses, food rationing, the lot, back to the Second World War, Great Patriotic War, as they call it. Now, Putin clearly does not want to do that. He has always been afraid in those circumstances of a public backlash. He has not gone along with the hardliners. What he would accept or aim at in terms of an eventual settlement, we don't know. Now, most of the Russians I've talked to have said, as far as both the elites and the mass of the population are concerned, if Putin, say, after it's become clear that the Ukrainian offensive has failed, were to say, bowing to the wishes, the will of the international community as expressed by our friends in Brazil and Indonesia and India, I now call a unilateral ceasefire, assuming the Ukrainians stick to it, along the present battle lines, and I propose negotiations without preconditions. The great majority of my acquaintances in Russia say, of course, this will also be spun by the Russian media, the state media, and government is a great success. But they said the great majority of the elites and the population would accept that and would be willing to go along with the idea that this was a sufficient Russian victory. But we don't know whether Putin would ever propose that. I mean, the one thing that Putin, he might accept an invitation to open-ended negotiations without a ceasefire, but there's no reason at all why he would do so if the West sets as preconditions things that he will never accept in terms of total withdrawal and so forth.
Do you think that a Korean scenario would be feasible, like geographically, a 38th parallel in Ukraine where you just have like a hard contact line but demilitarized and somehow is that geographically plausible or not?
It's possible, but the thing is, the line longer. The partition of the Korean Peninsula was along. This is what made, of course, the Korean War so very different from the Vietnam War. It's a much shorter line, much more easily defined, cutting a peninsula in two. The line in Ukraine is much longer. And also, my fear, as far as the stability of something like that is concerned, there are two fears. One is, of course, that both sides would continue to try to undermine the other. And you would certainly have groups in Ukraine which would continue what they would call resistance, the Russians would call terrorism in the Russian-occupied areas, by assassinating local officials and collaborators and so forth. My fear is, from that point of view, that it might look a lot more like Kashmir, where you've also had ceasefires, but constantly interrupted by exchanges of fire, terrorism attacks, and every now and again, not of course in any way most of the time, but occasionally full-scale war. But there's another thing, which I should have added, which follows on from what I said about Russia. I don't think there's any doubt that as a result of the collapse of the Wagner mutiny and the, I would say without question, assassination of Prigozhin, Putin has, restored a measure of authority, of his personal authority within Russia. You might not like the means, not at all, but it is so. A tremendous fear in the Zelensky government and among Western backers of Ukraine is that if Zelensky ever agreed to a ceasefire without getting back, let alone a peace settlement, without getting back the lost Ukrainian territories, he would face a coup. And indeed, even advisors to Zelensky have said on the record that if he were to do that, he would have signed his political death warrant. He hadn't actually threatened a military uprising, but
or his physical death warrant, which is what happened to Diem when he was negotiating with North Vietnam.
perhaps. Every single analyst I talked to in Ukraine believed that General Zaluzhny in future will be a candidate for president, either in succession to Zelensky or in opposition to Zelensky. And so, of course, just as, a key reason why so many people, whether actually, from the sort of liberal side, insofar as that still exists in the elites, or the hardline military side in Russia, will not support a revolt or a coup against Putin, because they know that that is the one thing which could ensure complete Russian military defeat in Ukraine. And quite apart from patriotism, especially in the army, of course, nobody wants to inherit government under the shadow of total defeat. But the thing that you see, the same thing goes in Ukraine. The fear is that if Zelensky were to make any kind of peace agreement, there could be, he could be overthrown, there could be political chaos in Ukraine, and then, well, all one can say is it would take very considerable restraint on the Russian side not to exploit that in an effort to win a much bigger victory. So, that, by the way, you quite often see this. One of the reasons why the US didn't try to push the Ghani regime in Afghanistan much harder towards some kind of agreement with the Taliban is that they were convinced, probably with good reason, that if he did that, the Afghan regime would split and collapse, which of course it did in the end anyway. And by the way, before, and we also know this because of the huge, the protests and the pressure on Zelensky. Zelensky was elected on a platform of seeking reconciliation with Russia and peace in the Donbass. That was wrecked by ultra-nationalist pressure from within Ukraine. And to be fair, if one wishes to be fair, to the French and Germans and the Americans over the Minsk agreement, officials said to me at the time, look, we cannot put pressure on Ukraine to fulfill the terms of the Minsk agreement, because there would be an ultra-nationalist revolt within Ukraine, and then that would play totally into Russia's hands. Well, of course, the answer to that is, look, if this is a country so menaced by internal, armed ultra-nationalism, why are we talking about membership of NATO and the European Union?
It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But last question, because in our circles of the internet, the idea is very strong that it's all the United States, that could strong arm Ukraine, and Donald Trump who said, "I know exactly how to end the war," which is like cut off all the funding tomorrow, right? Do you also believe that that's an option, or actually are we beyond that point in which, like, even the United States and NATO, even if they put in everything and talked to Zaluzhny and talked to everybody and told everybody this is over, give up, this is an order, do you think the Ukrainian ultra-right, ultra-nationalists would be capable of just saying, like, screw it, we've got enough weapons, we'll continue anyhow, and we'll do this suicide attacks and stuff?
I honestly don't know. Their emotions would certainly point in that direction. It's not quite the same as the Kurds in the past, or the South Vietnamese or the Afghans, but one can imagine a number of scenarios in the world, particularly with regard to China or internally in the US, which would lead a US administration in the end to say, actually, Ukraine isn't that important. You've got to do the best deal you can, or sorry, it's all over. But of course, the point is that there would be a colossal backlash against that within Ukraine, within America, in Eastern Europe, in Britain, ever since, basically, ever since the whole question of the enlargement of NATO first came up, European governments, and a great many Americans as well, the Biden administration, when it came to power, have been more scared of divisions and unpopularity and unhappiness in their own camp, rather than the wider international ramifications of what they do or relations with Russia, and so have always followed the path of least resistance. The Germans sum this up. They followed the path of least resistance in economic dependence on Russian gas, without having the moral or intellectual or political courage to say, look, if we're going down that path economically, we just have to seek, strategic accommodation with Russia, and from a Russian point of view, recognize Russian fears and Russian vital interests and other. But of course, that would have led to splits in NATO and domestic unpopularity. So, of course, the path of least resistance, I would say, cowardly policy, is just to let things drift, to do both, until, of course, eventually you fall over a cliff.
Yeah, and it's stupid. It's just an extremely, extremely stupid situation to be in. But it's thanks to people like you that we sometimes get little articles that actually shine a little light of reason. So, Anatol Lieven, thank you very much for the talk today.
It was a pleasure, Pascal. Thank you.